This is video lecture 28, and in this lecture I'm going to go outside of my comfort zone and talk a little bit about ethology and the complexity in behavior and behaviors that are not due to learning situations but innate expressions of predetermined behavior. So just a recap from some of the earlier chapters, chapter 1, in which we just discussed the process of natural selection, Darwin's evolution of species, that through the process of natural selection in which nature selects the traits that are most adaptive, species can of course change, and the most obvious changes that one sees are physical in nature. Changes in sturdiness or ability to maintain body temperature, strength, what have you. All of these would be examples of change that come from the forces of natural selection. But it's also important to remind ourselves that behavioral changes, tendencies to act in one way versus another, certainly have survival advantage as well. And so those kinds of behavioral tendencies can also be shaped through the process of natural selection. So heredity certainly can affect how an organism learns as well as how they behave. When this occurs across species, we refer to this, or the collection of behaviors, as fixed action patterns, and we will delve into fixed action patterns in a short while. But in terms of the selective pressures that particular species face, it's not surprising that natural selection and evolutionary forces would shape certain behaviors and make them more likely because of their benefits to the organism's survival. So let's examine how some selection processes can affect a behavioral or learning endpoint. And so how might evolution affect behavioral tendencies? So on the screen are some data from a study conducted back in 1940 by Trione. And in this study, Trione tested rats on a series of mazes and recorded how good they were on the maze. More errors means the animals were less proficient, and fewer errors means that they were more proficient. And so the more proficient animals were considered to be bright rats, and the less proficient ones were considered to be dull rats. And so once he had determined which rats were good at the maze and which rats were not so good at the maze, he selectively bred the brightest with the bright and the dullest with the dull. Now, of course, this isn't an example of natural selection, it's an example of artificial selection, but it serves as an example in terms of how selection processes can serve to shape behavioral differences by the end of that process. And so with each successive generation of breeding the brightest of the bright with the dullest of the dull and so forth, or I'm sorry, with the brightest, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The brightest with the bright and then the dullest with the dull to create two separate distributions here. And you can see that playing out in image A there, or panel A of that image. We see that that distribution is very broad. Along the x-axis we have the total number of errors that these rats are committing. And of course, the greater the number of the errors, the less bright they are. The fewer number of the errors, the more bright they are. And what Trione did was then select from the extremes of this distribution and only bred the bright with the bright and the dull with the dull, and did that generation after generation, all the while testing them on this particular maze. And what happened was, as he began to do this generation after generation, in later generations, after a series of interbreeding bright with bright and dull with dull, he got to the point whereby the outcome in panel D is depicted there, two distributions of rats. The bright rats depicted in the gray shaded area and the dull rats depicted in the white shaded area. There's almost no overlap between these two distributions. And so whatever behavioral tendencies that the bright rats benefited from, those were maintained and passed on to future generations. Those tendencies were not as apparent in the dull rats, and therefore that distribution did not pass those tendencies on to future generations. And what we have by the end of all of this is two different, separate, mutually exclusive distributions in which there is very little overlap. And so through the process, in this case of artificial selection, we can demonstrate that just behavioral tendencies in and of themselves can be, and of course no one's promoting, and I'm certainly not promoting the idea that the knowledge of the maze was being transferred from one generation to the next. That's not the case. But the tendencies that made earlier generations good at the maze and other generations poor at the maze, when you selectively breed within those distributions, you get more and more disparate distributions with each passing generation. So the tendencies that make them good or the tendencies that make them bad are passed forward. And in the end, we can create two almost mutually exclusive distributions. So I'm going to step outside my comfort zone here and talk a little bit about ethology. Now, this was discussed in Chapter 12 as well. I am not an ethologist. I'm not a comparative psychologist, but I find these case studies, and I will be focusing on some experiments and some case studies, particularly fascinating and an important reminder that anyone who is interested in learning must also respect Mother Nature and the biology with which we are born. And in many cases, as is the topic of Chapter 12 here, there are limits that our biology places on us beyond the most obvious limits of, us not being able to fly. Those are obvious and, for the most part, uninteresting. It's the more subtle biological limitations that are placed upon us that affect our ability to learn. But having said that, just taking a step back and just admiring the marvel that is some of the complexity in behaviors that are expressed in different animal species, I think is a worthwhile endeavor. And so what I hope to achieve in the remaining slides here is not only to make points regarding biologically based behaviors, and which is the realm of ethology, but also just give students an appreciation for examples of complexity in animal behavior and behavior that is not due to learning situations or reinforcement. These are biologically determined behaviors, and one might be compelled, if happened upon seeing one of these behaviors being expressed, would come to the conclusion that it has to be due to learning and or their experiences, and they would be wrong. So ethologists study the role of behaviors, and so animals expressing particular behaviors within their environments within the context of species-specific behaviors. Through the process of evolutionary forces, certain species of behaviors have evolved to express certain behaviors that benefit their survival. So classical ethologists focused on survival instincts and behaviors such as feeding and courting and foraging and so forth. And so one distinction that I want to make before moving forward is a distinction that ethologists make regarding the category of behavior that is being expressed. And that is the distinction between consumatory behaviors and appetitive behaviors. So consumatory behaviors are behaviors in which the organism engage in innate, genetically determined survival behaviors, which determine species-specific patterns of feeding, courting, reproduction, and social interactions. In short, it is the engagement in innate, genetically determined survival behaviors. So the consumatory behaviors, for the most part, operate at the level of the central nervous system. Appetitive behaviors, however, are categories of behaviors in which seeking and approaching types of behaviors are emitted. So appetitive behaviors are a category of behaviors in which seeking and approaching type behaviors are emitted. Appetitive behaviors lead to the expression of consumatory behaviors. So I'll make that distinction as we go through some of the examples in this lecture. So the first person I want to point to is Konrad Lorenz. So you can see in the image in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen here, Lorenz is being followed by 3 geese. Lorenz is famous for his discovery of the process of imprinting, in which an organism, an animal, will treat the first moving object it sees within a critical period as its mother. So for geese, for example, the critical period is within the first few hours following hatching. It's important to note that imprinting does not occur in all species. It is very species specific, and more accurately, it occurs, or it's more likely to occur, in species that are mobile at birth. Ducks and geese and deer and so forth. If they are mobile at birth, they are more likely to come into this world with the tendency to imprint. And so during that first critical period, within the first few hours of being born, the first object that it sees that is moving, they become locked on to that particular target. Now 99% or 99.9% of the time, that object, of course, is the mother. But if an ethologist is waiting in the wings and is the first object that it sees moving, or not even the person itself, animals that imprint have been known to imprint on inanimate objects. For example, a model train. And so baby ducks were born in the center of a model train exhibit, rather. And because that was the first object that they saw moving, they chased the train around as if it were their mother from that point forward. And so this is beneficial. This shapes their survival. It makes them much more likely to survive. No learning is required as they come out of the egg or what have you. If they are mobile, their tendency is to fixate on the first moving object. In almost every instance, that first moving object is the mother, and therefore it will follow that mother around and be protected by her. So we can see from the survival perspective that this makes perfect sense, and it happens absolutely without any consideration of learning and or experience. So fixed action patterns are defined as inherited complex behaviors that are elicited by very specific stimuli, and those stimuli are referred to as releasing stimuli, or also referred to as sign stimuli. I have a tendency to use the term sign stimulus or sign stimuli, but I will use the terms interchangeably: releasing stimulus or releasing stimuli, and or sign stimulus or sign stimuli. And so what's notable in that definition is that these behaviors are often complex. You might be compelled, if you were standing from afar and watching a particular behavior unfold, you might be compelled to think that due to its complexity, that it cannot solely be determined or be driven by inherited behavioral tendencies. And if you would think that, you would be incorrect. These behaviors occur innately and are part of the blueprint of the animal's biology. And so there are some requirements for fixed action patterns, or characteristics, I guess, if you will, of fixed action patterns. They are inherited, and so therefore all members of the species demonstrate this particular behavior. What's also interesting is that once a fixed action pattern begins, because it is occurring at the level of the central nervous system, once it begins, it continues until completion. These behaviors are hardwired because they have a survival advantage. And so if they are triggered by a sign stimulus or a releasing stimulus, they will go to completion, regardless of whether that is necessary or not. The organism is more or less at the mercy of their central nervous system at that point until it has been exhausted. And then lastly, the point needs to be made again, although these behaviors are complex, it is not due to learning. These animals are born with this innate behavioral tendency. So I have some examples there, some images depicting fixed action patterns, or maybe better described as when fixed action patterns go awry here. We have a bird feeding fish at the edge of a pond in the upper right-hand corner, and what those fish are doing and what those fish have learned is that they can trick the birds that feed by the edge of the pond into feeding them, because an open mouth is a sign stimulus for birds to trigger a feeding behavior such that they will go out, retrieve a piece of food, and return to where they saw the sign stimulus and deliver that food to that organism. In most cases, this is highly beneficial because birds feed their young, and when they see the mouth agape of their recent hatchlings, that prompts them to go out, retrieve food, and return to the nest. But here we see that fish are short-circuiting that biologically based behavioral tendency and getting birds that feed by the edge of this pond to feed them. Additionally, there's an image there of a North American cowbird. You can see this bird is gigantic sitting in that nest. He is getting that other bird to feed it using a similar mechanism. It sits in the host's nest, opens its mouth, and that serves as a sign stimulus compelling that bird to go out, find food, and feed this stranger who has taken up residence in her nest. And so they once again short-circuiting this biologically based behavioral tendency. And so once again, that speaks to how automatic and how involuntary this particular behavior is. Now, within the Oaks portal is a link to some research that is similar to the work done by Nico Tinbergen, who discovered fixed action patterns in stickleback fish, the mating behavior, as well as the tendency for the males to act aggressively toward other males. And so I will expect students to watch that video clip. It's several minutes long, but it highlights the relevant sign stimuli that elicit these fixed action patterns in the stickleback fish. But again, it's important to remember that these behaviors are occurring at the level of the central nervous system, being triggered by relevant stimuli in the environment of these animals. And of course, the relevant stimuli are determined by evolutionary forces for past generations. So the question then is it possible for a stimulus that is maybe not so relevant, or maybe peripherally relevant, that would elicit a similar or maybe even a stronger fixed action pattern? And the answer to that question is yes. There are examples of what are known as supernormal stimuli. And a supernormal stimulus is a stimulus that is preferred to the innate or natural sign stimulus. So in the case of these birds here, the sight of an adult bird with its mouth open is more powerful than the sight of their own hatchling's mouth open. It's larger, it's more visible, and therefore it has a tendency to dominate their behavior, and they are compelled to respond to that rather than respond to the sign being depicted, rather, I guess, by her own hatchlings. Similarly, I'll mention this now and come back to it in a couple of minutes. In the graylag goose, they engage in an egg retrieval behavior. That is an example of a fixed action pattern. And ethologists have discovered that they can actually trick these geese into retrieving objects that aren't their eggs. Balls or rocks that are painted a slightly different color. And what they found was that they can actually create stimuli that are preferred to the naturally occurring sign stimulus. So that is an example of a supernormal stimulus, a stimulus that is preferred over the naturally eliciting sign stimulus. And of course, that is an anomalous outcome, but one that is achievable nevertheless. So let's talk about the gray lag goose. Ethologists have discovered, Tinbergen and others have discovered, a very repeatable fixed action pattern in these female geese. Now, female geese lay their eggs in aquatic environments near water sources, and so the possibility of flooding always exists. And so that they have a tendency to build their nests up on little mounds to protect them from the eggs sitting in a damp and or watery environment, if you will. But because the eggs are elevated relative to the ground around them, there's the possibility that the egg can actually squirt out from underneath the female geese and roll away from the nest. And so geese have evolved to be activated, if you will, by the sight of an egg outside their nest. The sight of the egg itself, is the sign stimulus. It elicits a fixed action pattern on behalf of the gray lag goose, in which they get up from their nest, which is indicated in panel A of that image there on the screen. So you can see that the gray lag goose has seen the object, has seen the sign stimulus. In this case, of course, it's the sight of an egg, and that then elicits the fixed action pattern. It gets up and goes to the egg, and what it does is it gets the egg underneath its bill. So it goes to the opposite side of the egg, extends its neck, and uses the back of its bill to begin pushing that egg back to the nest. And so you can see that being expressed in panel C. So that goose now has the egg at the back of its bill, and it is now moving in a very stereotypic fashion, moving that egg back to the nest. And when it gets it back to the nest, it will sit back down and begin searching and keeping an eye on the horizon for other sign stimuli. And so based on the terms that I used a few minutes prior of consumatory and appetitive behaviors, we can see that as the goose sits upon her nest and she scans the horizon for potential sign stimuli, for potential eggs that have rolled out of her nest, that is an example of an appetitive behavior. She is seeking and approaching, looking for relevant stimuli upon which she can respond. When she sees one, that then triggers the fixed action pattern, which is an example of a consumatory behavior. And from that point on, she is essentially at the mercy of her nervous system. That fixed action pattern is elicited automatically, it is complex, and it will go to completion. How do we know this? Because ethologists have found that if they are waiting in the wings or hiding behind the bushes and they take a stick and poke that egg away from the goose as she tries to roll it back to her nest, she doesn't stop. She doesn't go after it. She continues in the action that she was engaging in previously, yet now she is rolling an invisible egg back to her nest. And she will go back to her nest, sit back down, and then begin scanning the environment. And lo and behold, she will see another egg on the horizon. Of course, it's the egg that she lost control of just a few seconds prior, but now she's up again and engaged in a new fixed action pattern. And so this tells us that this is a behavior that occurs at the level of the central nervous system. It is biologically determined, and even when it is no longer necessary, as is the case when the egg is poked away or it rolls away naturally. Eggs are oblong, they are hard to control, and sometimes they do get away. It doesn't stop the goose. They continue to roll this now invisible egg, this absent egg, back to their nest because they are at the mercy of their central nervous system. Are they completely at the mercy? Is there any evidence that they have sensitivity to what is occurring during the process? The answer to that question is yes. There is a subcategory of behaviors referred collectively as taxis, and taxis are behaviors that are engaged in that show sensitivity to environmental feedback. And so an example in this behavior, in which the gray-lag goose is rolling the egg back to the nest, the gross motor movements of the head bobbing back and forth and the legs backing up as they roll the egg below them and back up onto the nest, those are all examples of fixed action patterns, and they are occurring more or less automatically. But if you look closely at the angle of the goose's head, you'll notice that she alters the angle of her head. As she can feel the egg underneath her bill, she knows she has to move her head to the left, to the right, and so forth to keep that egg centered. If she fails and the egg happens to roll away, she doesn't stop. She keeps rolling this now invisible egg, but if you look closely, you'll notice that the taxis, those subtle movements in the bill, angle of the bill and the head, stop. So she is sensitive to the fact that the egg is now gone, but she's at the mercy of her nervous system, and so she will go back to the nest, sit back down, and then she'll be back up and going again because she sees the egg that got away from her. So these are part of her biological makeup, and they, of course, and it's obvious to anyone who's listening, that this behavior is beneficial for the survival of the species. Keeping the eggs at a proper temperature in a dry environment is imperative for the survival of the species. And so why risk it? It becomes part of the behavioral repertoire of this species of waterfowl. So what about navigation in birds? Birds are pretty amazing for many reasons, not the least of which is that they can fly, but that's the obvious. That's some of the obvious, or an example of an obvious behavioral achievement. How do they know in which direction to fly? How do they know to migrate? North in the summer, south in the winter. And so living here in South Carolina, we benefit from this. We see this migration. We can see the geese going over our heads in the spring and in the fall. And they are migrating north in the spring and south in the fall. How do they know this? Is this a product of their upbringing? Is it an experience that they have when they're young? Do they learn from their elders that when a newly hatched bird learns their first migration because they follow the elder birds of their flock, and they learn through observation? Is that how this happens? Or is there something else operating that makes birds, or certain migratory birds, capable of doing this absent any prior experience? And so then the question is this learned through trial and error and or observational learning? How do they learn to navigate? So Emlyn was particularly interested in this, and Emlyn is unique and quite creative, if you ask me, because he didn't go where you think you might go to study migratory patterns of indigo buntings, which is a migratory bird in Europe and elsewhere, but he studied them in Europe. And so you might think that he would go out to areas where these birds live and watch their migratory patterns, but he turned this into an experiment. He brought this into the laboratory and created an experimental space that allowed him to make inferences about the migratory tendencies of indigo buntings that were under his care. And so he created these unique looking cages, which are depicted there in the bottom right hand portion of the screen. These indigo buntings were kept in a lab. They were kept in a normal bird aviary, in which the light cycle could be controlled, lights on, signaling daytime, lights off, signaling nighttime. But he also did something interesting in that he projected a map of the stars, an accurate celestial map of the stars, onto the ceiling. And so you can buy these projectors that do such a thing. You turn the lights off and you can see what appears to be the nighttime sky indoors. And so he did this in the aviary in which the birds were kept. And of course these things rotate and are accurate reflections of the normal nighttime sky. And so he has these birds. They were born in captivity. They were raised in isolation. And they are being kept in these unique, I guess for the very least, unique cages in which there's an ink pad at the bottom of these cages, and there's a paper funnel that kind of spreads out from the bottom. And what he did was he looked to see, as these birds, so they're being kept in these cages, but there's still a tendency for them to move around, and in some cases try to fly. They're big enough that these birds can actually have some mobility, not only along the ground, but some mobility upwards. And so as they would try to fly, he would see where they were flying because they were standing on an ink pad. There was ink on their feet, and therefore they would make ink prints on that paper funnel that he could measure the next day. And so what he did was he manipulated the seasons within the aviary. The signaling of the coming of the summer was done by expanding the light period. And so moving from a 10-hour light period to an 11-hour, to a 12-hour, to a 14-hour, right? When summer comes, the days get longer and there's more light. And so this elongation of the light period served as a signal to the indigo buntings that summer was coming. Similarly, he also signaled the coming of the winter, and he made the light cycle shorter, and whereby it was dark for a greater period than it was light. And then he would measure the tendency of where the birds positioned themselves within these cages. And what he found was that when the days were becoming longer, these indigo buntings had a tendency to orient themselves within their cage in the northern or in a northerly direction, that all of their footprints were on the north portion of the paper funnel. When winter was being signaled, most of their ink prints were on the southern portion of the paper funnel. And so these birds just knew that when summer was coming, that their natural inclination was to orient toward north, and when winter was coming, their natural inclination was to orient toward the south. And the question then is, how do they do this? And what Emlyn discovered was that they use the nighttime sky. They're able to chart their direction, figure out where their direction is within the aviary based on the location of the North Star in the nighttime sky. And so these birds then come into this world with that ability to chart their orientation, their direction based on the North Star in the nighttime sky, and their behavior, or orientations rather, are determined based upon that. Head toward it in the summer, head away from it in the winter. And keep in mind that there are no other cues within this aviary for the birds to determine which direction is north, which direction is south. The only cue or clue that they had was to map out the northern star. So the question then, complex, impressive if you will, is the ability innate or learned? This is most definitely an innate tendency. They do not learn from their elders. They come equipped when they come into this world to be able to navigate via the North Star. And then lastly, I will leave you with a story of bee communication. So Hermann von Frisch is a naturalist who won a Nobel Prize in his discovery of bee communications, that honeybees communicate amongst each other. They actually have a language that communicates information amongst the hive. And he discovered by setting up different hives in different locations and setting up food sources and so forth, and he would paint bees once they found a food source, and he'd follow that bee back to its hive and see the types of behaviors that these scout bees were engaging in when they went back to the hives. And what he discovered, quite surprisingly, is that the scout bees engage in two different kinds of dances. And the dances themselves are communicative of information. To tell the forager bees that I have found food and you need to go get it and bring it back to the hive. So scout bees go out, find food, they come back, communicate the location of that food, and then the forager bees go out and bring it back to the hive. And so how do they do this? Well, there are two types of communications, or two types of dances. The most basic kind of dance is the round dance, in which the bee comes back to the hive and it essentially dances around in a circular pattern. And this conveys to the forager bees that are watching this dance unfold It conveys one piece of information, distance. The round dance conveys distance. It tells the forager bees the food is close. Circle the hive and you'll find it yourself. And so if the food is close, the scout bees come back and engage in the round dance, in which they dance in a circle on the side of the hive while the forager bees observe this. If, however, food is farther away, which is likely, more information needs to be conveyed. So the round dance conveys one piece of information, and that is distance only, specifically close. The waggle dance then communicates two pieces of information. Because food is further away, you can't just simply tell the other forager bees, go fly around, you'll find it. That is inefficient. So the waggle dance conveys not only distance, but direction. And so direction is conveyed by the angle of the waggle in the dance, and I'll describe that in just a second. The angle of the waggle relative to perpendicular. So the hive is up and down. The scout bee will dance at a particular angle relative to perpendicular, and that angle is important. It conveys information to the forager bees. They calculate that angle, and they use that angle when they leave the hive relative to the sun. So they find the sun. So let's say the scout bee is engaged in a waggle dance, and so over here in this diagram here, we have a waggle that is being depicted here at roughly 30 degrees. And so here it's up and down, perpendicular, and we can see if we draw a line right through the center of this waggle, let's say this is a 20-degree angle right here. And so what that says to the other bees that are watching this, that are in this hive here, find the sun, move to the right of that, to the sun 20 degrees and head in that direction. And so the angle of the waggle relative to perpendicular conveys to the forager bees, find the sun, move in a direction equivalent to that angle, and head in that direction. So the angle of the waggle conveys direction relative to the sun. And bees can see ultraviolet light, and so even if it's cloudy, the bees can know where the sun is. And so that is a consistent landmark for bees to use and from which they can operate. The second piece of information is distance. How far do the bees need to go in a direction that they already now know based on the angle of the waggle relative to perpendicular? Well, the speed of the waggle, how fast the bees vibrate essentially back and forth. They waggle their backsides at a particular frequency that is specific to the distance. And so there we go. There's an example right there of a bee in the center engaging in a waggle dance. I'll repeat that. I hope it works. There we go. You can see that it is essentially vibrating back and forth. The rate or frequency of that vibration is important. It is specific to the distance that the forager bees need to travel. The faster the waggle, the more frequent it is per unit time, the closer the food, and the slower the waggle, meaning they shake back and forth less frequently, the farther the food is. And now I admit that the terms closer and farther are relativistic terms, but in actuality there's a pretty close correspondence between the actual frequency of the waggle and a specific distance for the forager bees. And so it's a pretty accurate communication. And so these bees have everything they need to know. They know which direction to go based on the angle of the waggle relative to perpendicular, find the sun, move in a direction equal to that angle, and then go a distance that is specified by the speed of the waggle. And they will find food at the end of their journey. Is this learned? It is most certainly not learned. This is an example of a biologically determined behavior occurring in insects. And so this is my last example here. Again, I admitted early on that I am not an ethologist. But these are a couple of experimental examples, case studies, if you will, of animal behavior that I find particularly interesting and like to share with students. And they remind us that behavior is amazing, and some behaviors, most behaviors, are amenable to reinforcement, but some behaviors that we observe are not the outcome of reinforcement, and they are instead the outcome of Mother Nature, and these are innate, biologically determined expressions of beneficial behaviors. And so I will leave you with that. I hope that you find this interesting. There is a video clip on oaks showing bees engaging in waggle dances, and entomologists studying this particular behavior, and so I hope you watch that clip. But I will expect students to understand the difference between the round dance and the waggle dance, and know what they convey and how each of these dances convey the information that they do. So to summarize, next time you see a bee, don't kill it. It has something important to say to its fellow bees back at the hive. So that does it for this video lecture, and that does it for all of the video lectures for this class. This is the last one. Some of this material is covered in the textbook, much of it is not, and so if you are struggling with some of the topics that I discussed, please obviously feel free to rewind and go back to those sections, and if questions remain, by all means post them in the discussion thread specific to this topic. But this is it. This is the last video lecture for this course.